My daughter-in-law locked me out of my own house and told me I had 30 minutes to collect my things before she changed the locks. My son stood behind her and said nothing. But when I went to grab my old toolbox from the garage, I found something that was never meant for my eyes. A manila envelope stuffed with documents that would unravel everything they had spent 2 years carefully building. What I read inside gave me the exact tools I needed to take back everything they had stolen from me. And I want to tell you exactly how I did it. If you are listening right now, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave me a comment telling me what city you are tuning in from. It means more to me than you know. Now take a breath, because what I am about to share with you made my hands shake for 3 days straight. You have been here long enough, Howard. That is what Melissa said to me on a gray Tuesday morning in October, standing in the kitchen doorway of the house I had paid for with my own retirement savings. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her tone was the flat, administrative kind, the tone you use when you are telling a contractor the job is finished and it is time to go. Corey and I have talked about it. We think it is best if you find your own place. I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter I had picked out myself 18 months earlier. I looked at my son. Corey was standing near the refrigerator, arms crossed, staring at the floor like a teenager who had been caught doing something wrong. He was 41 years old. He could not look at me. Your own place, I repeated slowly. I see. Melissa sighed and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear. She had that practiced patience in her expression, the kind that tells you the person has rehearsed this conversation several times before delivering it. It is nothing personal, Howard. You know that. We just feel like we need our space as a family. The kids are getting older. We need the guest room back. The guest room. That is what she called the room I had been sleeping in for a year and a half. The room I had painted myself. The room where I had lain awake every night since my wife, Carol, passed away from ovarian cancer 3 years prior, staring at the ceiling and trying to remember how to want to get up in the morning. I had sold our home in Knoxville 6 months after Carol died. The grief counselor said it might help to be closer to family. Corey had come to me with big eyes and bigger promises. He and Melissa had just bought a 4-bedroom colonial in Asheville, North Carolina, and they were struggling. 2 car payments, a private school tuition for my grandson, Eli, and Melissa's student loan debt from her graduate program that she never finished. When Corey sat across from me at my kitchen table in Knoxville and told me they needed help, I did what fathers do. I reached into the only thing Carol and I had spent 40 years building, and I pulled out everything I had. $380,000. That was my share from the sale of our Knoxville home, along with the remainder of Carol's small life insurance policy. Every penny of it. I wired it directly to Corey and Melissa's mortgage lender, paid the colonial off completely, cleared their car loans, and paid 6 months of Eli's school tuition in advance. In return, Corey had put his arm around my shoulders and told me I would always have a home with them. He said it twice. He looked me in the eye both times. Now Melissa was standing in the kitchen I had funded and telling me I had 30 minutes to collect my things before she called a locksmith. I do not have a car, I said. You can call a cab. She picked up her phone. The conversation from her perspective was already over. Corey still had not looked up from the floor. I walked to the garage slowly. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I was 67 years old, and I was too tired and too hollowed out from grief to perform the kind of scene she was waiting for me to make. I think she wanted me to yell. I think it would have made things easier for both of them if I had given them a reason. The garage smelled like motor oil and old cardboard. Corey had pushed most of my things into the far corner behind his riding mower some months back. My fishing gear, Carol's boxes I had never been able to open, my old steel toolbox that I had hauled from job site to job site for 35 years as a licensed general contractor. I crouched down beside the toolbox and reached for the latch. That is when I saw it. There was a manila envelope tucked flat along the back of the toolbox, pressed between the metal casing and the concrete wall. It must have slipped back there or been placed there in a hurry. It had no writing on the outside. I picked it up. The flap was not sealed, just folded over. I do not know what made me open it. Maybe I was hoping it was something of Carol's. Maybe I just needed one single thing that morning to go differently than expected. Inside were 4 documents: a bank statement, a notarized letter, a printed email chain, and a real estate contract. I stood in the garage with the cold October light coming through the single high window, and I read every page, twice. By the time I heard Melissa calling from inside the house telling me time was running out, I had folded the envelope carefully and slipped it inside the inner lining of my winter jacket. My hands were steady. My face was completely blank. 35 years of dealing with difficult clients and dishonest subcontractors had taught me that the most dangerous thing you can do is let someone know exactly what you are holding. I came back inside, picked up my single duffel bag from the guest room, and called a cab. I kissed Eli on the top of his head. He was 9 years old, and he hugged my leg and asked me where I was going. I told him I was going on a little adventure. I did not look at Corey. I did not say goodbye to Melissa. I walked out the front door, sat on the porch steps in the cold, and waited for the yellow cab to come around the corner. I want you to understand what was in that envelope, because it is the only way the rest of this story makes any sense. The bank statement was from a joint account I did not know existed. It was opened 11 months ago in both Corey's name and Melissa's name. The opening deposit was $200,000. I recognized the transfer source immediately. It was the account number from the wire I had sent 18 months prior. They had not used all of my money to pay down the mortgage. They had quietly skimmed $200,000 off the top and placed it in a separate account, one I had never been shown and would never have found on my own. The notarized letter was a property amendment, because I had transferred the funds as a personal gift. No contract, no deed interest, just a wire transfer born from a father's blind love. My name was never on the title. The amendment had been filed with Buncombe County 8 months ago. It added a clause that specifically restricted any future claim by a non-titled occupant on the basis of financial contribution to the property. In plain language, even if I could prove I paid for the house, this amendment made it nearly impossible for me to recover any portion of it without a lengthy, expensive legal battle. Someone had advised them on this. Someone who knew property law well enough to close the door before I even realized there was a door to walk through. The email chain was between Melissa and someone named Brendan. No last name, just Brendan. From the content of the messages, he was clearly an attorney. The chain was from about a year ago, back when I had just settled in, and everyone was still pretending to be a happy family. Melissa had written, "He's never going to ask to see the financials. He trusts Corey completely. That's the beauty of it." Brendan had replied, "Just make sure the amendment is filed before you ask him to leave. Once it's recorded, he has no standing." And then, further down, in a message from Melissa that made my jaw tighten like a vice, "What about his pension? Is there a way to get access to that too?" Brendan had written back, "That's trickier. We'd need a guardianship filing. Does he show any signs of cognitive decline?" There it was. They were not just pushing me out. They had been planning this from the moment I handed them my life savings. The colonial was only the first step. The second step was my monthly pension from the state of Tennessee, which I received for 30 years of licensed contracting work. The third step was declaring me incompetent and installing Corey as my legal guardian, so they could access it directly. I sat in the back of the cab and stared out the window as Asheville moved past me in the gray morning light. The driver asked me where I was headed. I gave him the name of the motor lodge off I-26 that I had passed 100 times without ever giving it a second thought. He nodded and turned up the heat without being asked. I was grateful for that small kindness more than I can say. Room 9 at the Ridgeline Motor Lodge cost $62 a night. It smelled like carpet cleaner, and the window AC unit rattled even though it was October. I sat on the edge of the double bed with the manila envelope on the comforter beside me. I laid all 4 documents out in order. I read them again. And then I did something I had not done in 25 years. I picked up the phone and called my old business attorney. Philip Greer had handled every contract dispute and lien issue I had faced over 3 decades of construction work. He had gotten me out of 2 wrongful termination claims, 1 supplier lawsuit, and a county permitting nightmare in Roane County back in 2003. He was retired now, technically, but he had a small office in downtown Knoxville, where he still took cases that interested him. When he heard my voice, he said, "Howard, it has been too long. What have you gotten yourself into?" I told him everything. He listened without a single interruption. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Scan those documents and send them to my email tonight," he said. "And Howard, don't call Corey. Don't respond to anything. Don't let them know you read that envelope." "I understand," I said. "Do you have any funds of your own they don't know about?" I did. Not much. Carol and I had kept a modest money market account at a local credit union in Knoxville that we had used for decades. Corey did not know about it. We never talked about it because we never needed to. It had about $47,000 in it. It was not a fortune, but in the right hands it could become something useful. "Good," Philip said. "Get some rest. We have a lot of work to do." I want to pause here because I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking, why didn't you just walk away? Why didn't you let it go, find a small apartment, and spend your retirement in peace? And I want to answer that honestly. If it had only been about the money, I might have done exactly that. I was not a young man looking to rebuild an empire. I was a 67-year-old widower who had already lost the most important person in his life. Money was not what I was fighting for. It was Eli. My grandson was 9 years old and living in that house, being raised by two people who had just demonstrated to me in clinical detail that they were willing to manipulate and deceive the people who loved them most. I had watched Melissa correct Eli in ways that made my stomach turn. Not abusive, nothing you could report, just the steady grinding kind of correction that trains a child to distrust his own instincts. And Corey, my son, was the kind of man who stood in a kitchen and stared at the floor while his father was being evicted. That was the man my grandson was learning to become. I was not going to let that go without a fight. Philip worked fast. Within 48 hours, he had reviewed all 4 documents and called me back with his assessment. The property amendment was legitimate on its surface, but its very existence was a problem for Corey and Melissa because it created a paper trail proving they had anticipated a legal challenge from me, which implied they knew what they were doing was ethically wrong, even if they had covered the legal angles. The bank statement showing the $200,000 diverted from my transfer could be characterized, in the right framing, as a breach of the implied conditions under which the gift was made. In Tennessee, where I was still a legal resident on paper, certain provisions existed around financial elder abuse that Philip believed were directly applicable to my situation. And the email chain between Melissa and Brendan the attorney was, in Philip's words, extraordinarily useful. They discussed using a guardianship filing to access your pension, Philip said. That is not just bad faith, Howard. In this state, conspiring to initiate a fraudulent competency, proceeding to gain financial control of a senior citizen, is a criminal matter, not just a civil one. "What do I do with that?" I asked. "You don't report it yet," he said. "You let them try. And when they make their move, we are already waiting for them." I asked Philip if he knew anyone in Asheville. He said he had a colleague there, a woman named Jean Tabor, who had spent 20 years as a family court litigator and knew more about guardianship proceedings in North Carolina than anyone he had ever met. He made a call. She agreed to take my case on a contingency arrangement, meaning she only got paid if we won. I met her at her office on Marymount Avenue 3 days after I moved into the Ridgeline. She was in her late 50s, small, and very still in the way that tells you a person has learned to be quiet so that other people will underestimate them. I liked her immediately. "Tell me about your grandson," she said, before I had even opened the envelope. I told her about Eli, about the way he had grabbed my leg that morning, about how he called me Pop, and how he had my late wife's eyes, and how the last real belly laugh I had experienced in 3 years was sitting on the back porch of that colonial with him on a summer evening, watching lightning bugs come up from the grass. Jean listened carefully. She wrote something small in her notepad. Then she looked at me and said, "Okay, here is what we are going to do." The plan had 2 layers. The first was proactive. We would file a quiet title action in Buncombe County Court, challenging the legitimacies of the property amendment based on the financial contribution I had made and the implied conditions under which it was transferred. Philip would work with Jean on the paperwork. It would not be fast, but it would go on record and it would signal to Corey and Melissa that I was not the passive, grieving old man they had assumed I would be. The second layer was reactive. We would wait for them to initiate the guardianship proceeding, which Jean was confident they would do once they realized I had retained counsel. A guardianship claim requires a formal competency evaluation. Jean had a relationship with a neuropsychologist at Mission Hospital who conducted independent evaluations for the courts. We would request an emergency evaluation immediately upon any filing, ensuring that the assessment came from someone with no connection to Melissa's attorney friend Brendan. I went back to the ridgeline and I waited. It took 11 days. On a Thursday afternoon, I received a certified letter at the motor lodge. It was a formal notification from Buncombe County District Court that a petition for adult guardianship had been filed by my son, Corey, citing concerns about my cognitive health and my ability to manage my financial affairs. Attached was a letter from a physician I had never met or visited, a Dr. Alan Marsh, stating that based on a telephone consultation and collateral information provided by my son, he had reasonable cause to believe I was experiencing early-stage dementia. A telephone consultation. The man had never laid eyes on me. I called Jean. She was not surprised. They moved faster than I expected, she said. That tells me Brendan pushed them. They probably found out about the title challenge and panicked. She had already been in contact with the neuropsychologist at Mission. My evaluation was scheduled for the following Monday morning. I spent the weekend in room 9 preparing. Not by studying or cramming. There is nothing to study for a cognitive evaluation. I prepared by sleeping well, eating real meals instead of the vending machine dinners I had been surviving on, and going for long walks along the French Broad River in the cold morning air. I was not worried about the test. I had spent 35 years estimating material quantities, reading structural blueprints, managing subcontractor schedules across multiple simultaneous job sites, and writing detailed compliance reports for county building departments. My mind was not in decline. It was the sharpest instrument I owned, and I had been sharpening it every day of my working life. On Monday, I sat across from Dr. Nora Whitfield in a quiet office at Mission Hospital and spent 5.5 hours answering every question she put in front of me. She tested my recall, my reasoning, my processing speed, my spatial orientation, my capacity for abstract thought. She gave me long sequences of numbers and words to reproduce. She put complex diagrams in front of me and asked me to explain what they represented. She asked me about current events, about historical dates, about financial concepts. She asked me to describe in sequence every step involved in framing a load-bearing interior wall. That last one, I suspect she threw in for me specifically. When it was over, Dr. Whitfield walked me to the lobby herself. She did not say anything unprofessional, but she shook my hand with both of hers, and she held it for just a moment longer than necessary, and that told me everything I needed to know. Jean called me the next morning. "The report is in," she said. "No evidence of cognitive impairment of any kind. In fact, Dr. Whitfield's notes describe your executive function as, and I am quoting directly here, notably superior for a subject of any age." She paused. "Howard, I want you to understand what this means. Corey and Melissa filed a guardianship petition supported by a physician who never examined you, based on information provided entirely by the people who stand to financially benefit from the outcome. That is not just a failed legal filing. That is potential fraud on the court." I was quiet for a moment. "What do we do with that?" "We let it breathe for about a week," Jean said, "and then we invite them to a meeting." The meeting was held in Jean's conference room on a Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon. Corey and Melissa arrived with Brendan, who turned out to be a thin man in his early 40s, with the kind of aggressively practiced confidence that usually means a person has spent their career in rooms where no one pushed back. He was carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a watch that cost more than my monthly pension. I was already seated when they walked in. I had arrived 20 minutes early. I was wearing my good blue blazer, the one I had bought for Carol's funeral and had not put on since. I sat with my hands folded on the table, and I watched them come through the door. Corey stopped when he saw me. Just for a second, something moved across his face. I did not know what to call it. It was not guilt exactly. It was something smaller than guilt, like a shadow of the thing guilt might have been, if it had been allowed to grow. Then Melissa touched his arm and steered him toward the chairs across from me, and the shadow was gone. Brendan sat down and opened his portfolio without introducing himself. "I assume we are here to discuss the title challenge," he said, directing his words to Jean. "My clients are willing to consider a settlement, but the position that Mr. Howard Barnes has any legal claim to the Asheville property is not one we are prepared to accept." Jean let him finish. Then she placed 3 documents on the table and pushed them across. "That is the neuropsychological evaluation from Dr. Whitfield at Mission Hospital," she said. "The second document is the certification from the Tennessee Department of Commerce confirming Mr. Barnes's full mental competency and his status as a protected individual under the Elder Financial Exploitation Statute. The third is a formal complaint that has been submitted to the North Carolina State Bar regarding the conduct of counsel who advised the filing of a guardianship petition supported by a non-examining physician's telephone consultation." The room went very quiet. Brendan picked up the third document slowly. His eyes moved across the page. The practiced confidence shifted. Not dramatically, he was too experienced for that, but I saw it, a very slight recalibration, like a man who had just realized the floor was not where he thought it was. "You filed a bar complaint," he said flatly. "Yesterday morning," Jean confirmed. Corey looked at Melissa. She was staring at the table. Her jaw was tight. I watched her, and I thought about the morning in the kitchen when she told me I had 30 minutes. And I thought about Eli asking me where I was going, and I kept my face very still. Jean continued, "The bank records showing the diversion of $200,000 from the original wire transfer have been forwarded to the Buncombe County District Attorney's Office, along with the email correspondence discussing the planned guardianship filing and its explicit financial motivation. We are not here to negotiate the title challenge, Brendan. We are here to give your clients one opportunity to resolve this matter before it becomes a criminal proceeding." That is when Melissa finally looked up, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked exactly like what she was, a person who had made a very serious miscalculation about who they were dealing with. "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice was different than it had been in the kitchen. The flat administrative certainty was gone. "I want 2 things," I said. It was the first time I had spoken since they walked in. I kept my voice even and quiet. "First, I want a notarized deed transfer placing me on title to the Asheville property as a joint tenant with right of survivorship, reflecting my financial contribution to the purchase price. My attorneys have prepared the language." I slid a document across the table. "Second, I want a formal custody arrangement giving me guaranteed visitation with my grandson, Eli, at minimum twice per month, formalized through the court and legally enforceable. Not a verbal promise, not a handshake, a court order." Corey made a sound. I think it was the beginning of an objection. Melissa stopped it with a hand on his arm. Brendan was reading the deed document carefully. He turned to the second page, then the third. He set it down and looked at his clients. Something passed between the 3 of them. Not words, just a long shared look that told me they had already gamed out scenarios and this one had just risen to the top. "Give us 20 minutes, Brendan said. Jean and I stepped into the hallway. She handed me a cup of coffee from the credenza near the door. We stood by the window that looked out over Marymount Avenue, and neither of us said anything for a while. "You did not ask for the money back," she said eventually. "I want to be on the title," I said. "That protects me going forward. The money is gone. I can live with that if I have Eli." She nodded slowly. "Most people in your position would have asked for the 200,000. "I know," I said, "but Eli is 9 years old and he is going to need someone in his corner who is not playing an angle. The money would have felt good for about 2 weeks. My grandson is going to need me for the next 20 years. Jean looked at me for a moment over her coffee cup. "I think Carol raised a good one," she said quietly. I had to look out the window for a while after that. When we went back in, Brendan had 3 items on the table in front of him: an executed agreement to the deed transfer, a proposed custody arrangement framework pending formal court filing, and a signed acknowledgement from both Corey and Melissa that the guardianship petition had been filed in bad faith, which Jean had required as a condition of withdrawing the bar complaint. Corey signed everything without looking up. Melissa signed without speaking. Brendan collected his copies, closed his portfolio, and left without shaking anyone's hand. Corey stood up to go. He had his coat in his hand, and he was almost to the door when he stopped. He did not turn all the way around. He just stopped moving, and he stood there for a moment with his back to me, and I could see from the set of his shoulders that something was working in him. Some old internal mechanism that I recognized from when he was a little boy and had done something wrong and was trying to figure out how to face it. "Dad," he said. Just that. One word. I waited. He did not say anything else. He put his coat on and walked out. Melissa followed without looking back. I sat in Jean's conference room for a long time after they left. She did not rush me. She gathered her paper and made some notes and let me sit. The first court-ordered visitation was 3 weeks later. A Saturday in November, cold and bright. I picked Eli up at 10 in the morning. He came running down the front steps with his jacket half on and grabbed my hand before I had even gotten all the way up the walk. We went to the farmer's market in downtown Asheville and we ate apple cider donuts and walked through the stalls looking at handmade things. He told me about school and about a book he was reading, about a boy who builds a boat, and about how he wanted to learn how to use real tools, not toy ones. I told him I knew something about tools. I told him I would teach him everything I knew. On the drive back to the Colonial, he fell asleep in the passenger seat, with his cheek pressed against the window and his hands folded in his lap. I drove slowly so the ride would last longer. The mountains were still and enormous on every side, and the sky above them was the particular deep blue that only comes in the south in November. The kind of blue that makes you feel like the world is much older and much more patient than you have been giving it credit for. I thought about Carol. I thought about all the years we had worked for something steady and good, and about how she used to say that the only inheritance worth leaving a child was the example of how to live. I had not always understood what she meant. I was beginning to understand it now. I pulled up to the house and sat in the driveway until Eli stirred. He blinked at me, still half asleep, and asked if we could do it again next time. I told him we absolutely could. I told him I was not going anywhere, and for the first time in 3 years, when I said those words, I meant them completely.